As a part of my ongoing protocol here at QAGOMA, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country here, the Turrbal and Yagara and Jagrapul countries, their communities and their elders and their families emerging. Looking at the Brisbane River now, and I offer my respect to the communities. Starting there, I'd love today to give a bit of a discussion around how to make some pigments and how to bring some art materials into someone's art practice that don't have to necessarily be framed in any kind of cultural framework necessarily. Domestic and non-art materials is really what I'm interested in today. In looking around me and looking around the spaces that we might be in, the classroom, or if we're even locked up at home, what's immediately around us, what are materials that are already there waiting, that might be already imbued with some content, pardon me, some content or some intention that you might bring over into an artwork. So if we click back to the work that was made in 2017 on commission from the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, which was the wall composition in Reckitt's Blue, that work used a laundry powder. So it was a non-art material. It was a laundry powder that was used in domestic homes. And from that setting, I was able to see that as an art material, a potential art material, because it behaved and it acted in the ways that other sanctioned or identified pigments have been used over the centuries. Of course, I didn't invent that process. Of course, Indigenous peoples across the globe had been using Reckitt's Blue as a dry blue powdered pigment for quite some time, a couple of centuries. And of course in central Queensland, Reckitt's Blue was already being used in the same way. But that for me is the foundation of looking at what materials are in our domestic setting that may not be coming in a jar or labelled as an art material that we can bring in and make some pigment from and then start to engage with. And for me, that's really about democratising. It's also, it frees us up from having to spend lots of money or to have access to stores, this kind of thing. But also it actually really clues in questions around what is in my world and what is already with me that might come into an artwork. So, looking around me here now, there's a collection of different materials that I've brought in. Some of them I've brought in from my studio that have been used in the process of making paintings and making pigment, and some have been collected for today. So, all of them tend to be fairly organic, and they tend to be materials that are readily available. One of the key things that is the binder for these is an acacia resin, an acacia that comes from, I believe, North Africa, gum arabic. Most people might be familiar with gum arabic. It's the binder that's used in watercolours, and it's been used since Renaissance time as a binder in holding earth pigments to make watercolours. So here is some of the raw crystal form gum arabic. Often it's purchased in liquid form. This for me is far better economically a way of using and engaging with gum arabic. The crystal forms are water soluble. They're very safe, and I understand that in multiple cultures that they actually used, gum arabic is used for food production. So it is safe. I've had it around my body a lot, and I believe it to be a really wonderful material that's now becoming more accessible. So gum arabic, as I say, is water soluble. Here is some gum arabic that we've added some almost boiling water to. I try to think of the materials compassionately, and I think extreme heat and extreme pressures and these kinds of things are potentially damaging the material, but also compassionately, good, strong, warm water feels better for me than boiling, proper boiling water on the gum arabic. So that's been enough to liquefy the gum arabic, just like putting a jube, a lolly into a glass of water, and it's now become slippery. And for me, I'll just come back to a bit of a caveat on this, is that some people might have a really clear, formal art world training in these materials, but I come at them with a strong sensibility to work with them as makes sense for me. So I actually kind of like gum arabic to be fairly slippery. I've spoken to others who are quite trained, and they talk about the ratios, the different quantities and ratios and these kinds of things. You can go there, that's great, but learning and playing with it, slippery is good enough for me. So that's probably there at that kind of coloration, you know, what is that, maybe sort of almost olive oil colour, is perfect for me. So I'll decant that now to get that off there so that it doesn't become too heavy as a film. And then, so that is a perfect solution of gum arabic for me, the way that I use it. And then those gum arabic crystals or nodules are still viable. So if I was to top that up again, you'd get an equal amount again. So it goes a really long way. And already that is probably technically slightly heavy saturation by some people's standards. So that could be split and split and split. So a few crystals really goes a long way in the gum arabic. So that's the basis of what I've been doing for a little while, is looking at tree saps and botanical resins that have historically been used and can be brought in as a binder for pigment. And gum arabic for me is the best because it's accessible and it goes so well. Might I just say that, like anything organic in liquid, it will go sour. It'll kind of go a bit vinegary or a bit cheesy after a couple of weeks. So beware of that and open them outdoors if you've had them going for a couple of weeks. So that's the foundation, that's the gum arabic. And then from there, I've brought in a range of different raw materials, which artists across cultures, across formal or informal training, inside and outside of the museum, artists have been using these similar kinds of materials and the same sensibility for tens of thousands of years. So here is some rust, so it's some ferrous steel surface rust off some plate that's near my studio. So that can be ground up, and I'll do that in a few moments. But that is essentially just iron oxide, the oxidization of steel. I have here a few rocks. This one is, I believe, part of an old red brick from around the studio as well, which I picked up a few years ago. I don't believe it's anything in that kind of mudstony. I reckon it's probably more been baked. I feel like it's a bit more of like a red brick, the corner of a red brick, or an inclusion or an imperfection out of a very old brick. And I've used that to draw onto concrete and to grind up and make pigment. So my preference is to be aware of the ways that cultural uses of what my family and other cultures might include as ochre, that they're significantly different to what I'm looking to talk about today. There are specific and even sacred reasons why ochre is designated and used and important that way, but certainly bricks and ferrous steel can be used and can be engaged with very safely and very lovingly in the same way. So that's a bit of a red brick. This is a sawn off old ferrous steel bolt. And if I wanted to today, I could use a palette knife, or even again, coming back even more basic, just an old spoon that you won't use again. I could pull some of the oxidization off that bolt, capture it in a good way, do that very sensitively and carefully, capture that oxidization, mix it with the binder. It might take a little bit more grinding down to consolidate it more as a paint, so that you don't just have sort of granules sitting in a liquid. But there's pigment there as well, which will get you in those rusty browns as well. For me, that bolt could be used over and over again if there was a small, maybe even a weak solution of an acid, vinegar, household vinegar. Dropping that into the vinegar overnight or every couple of days, you'll have a ready supply of the different oxidizations between, you know, bright yellows through to browns, just from a bolt that you've picked up even on the side of the road. And so for me, that's an ongoing source. But also, I'll just show before I start grinding, other really accessible forms of pigment might be the residue from a good black coffee. So, might I say, during COVID times, keeper cups haven't been so welcome. So I've got a couple of dried out long black cups here. And what I'll do soon is use some of the gum arabic and transfer that pigment. And again, that will carry as something you can make marks with and tell a story. For me, already there's a story in that. given that keeper cups during COVID time haven't been so welcome, I've been, in some cases, not much choice other than to take a paper cup, which I prefer not to. Then already I can use that to tell a story of this time. The fact that I'm using a paper cup as a disposable resource I prefer not to, already that's loaded with intent, already that's loaded with something that I can draw on to tell part of a story if I wanted to sit and make something. So what might be thrown away already has a bit of a story there, particularly if you have a bit of a need for coffee. That can be part of the process of drawing out that pigment, and it is fairly stable. We've all seen tea bags and coffee used in staining and patinaing in craft and art processes for a really long time. So that is cheap and readily loaded with story if you want to go there. There's another, but also I have made use of the different sort of batches that I've made up, and I try to keep them nearby. Because the gum arabic is water soluble, you can come back time and time again like watercolor and pick that up and keep using it. So even though technically that's been used up as a batch, there's still enough pigment in there to tell quite a story on a sheet of watercolor paper. So again, coming back to thinking about resources, again thinking about what's around us and making the most of what's around us, I'd suggest that there's enough in there for a couple of people to make a painting in terms of pigment, and reconstituting that with the gum arabic. So maybe that is now time to, I'll start with the coffee, use some of the liquid gum arabic solution and just loosen it up. It happens very readily, and already there's a pigment transferring. This is all knowledge that we all already have. It's just some of the questions as an artist is, what do we already have around us that we can draw upon to start to build the cultures and the visual cultures that we want, right? So we already know coffee transfers like this, and very readily it will continue to spread and make marks, and I'll show it up for the camera in a moment. But you can go between really heavy densities, thinning it back out with a little more gum arabic, and start to do washes. So what happens if a dialogue is established with an artwork? Asking questions, it could be something in the trade of coffee, or it could be something in your inability to access cafes if you're in somewhere that's locked down, this kind of thing. So instantly we have content and intention of the artist imbued in the materials as soon as you pick them up. So they will dry down, and also because again the gum arabic is water soluble, you can come back and push them and move them around. Again, it's really very similar to watercolor. So many people might be highly trained in watercolor. It's just another development upon there for me. So that's black coffee. So having looked at a leftover coffee cup and made marks using the gum arabic as the binder, that is the initial points to making a work. You've already begun the process, the performative element is there, it's already loaded up. So then from here, the marks can be developed out, and Terry made a great point a moment ago about they can be scanned, they can be used, digitized, they can be drawn out of the fact that they're a mark, but at least the process has begun in making gestures and taking form. So from the very grassroots and basic democratic kind of processes, I'll swing back now to where some of my other information has come from around how to draw pigments from, paints from pigments that are around us. Part of the Queensland Art Gallery's process is the conservation team, and the team here have been able to give access to some of the historical pigments that were highly precious and highly prized and seriously worked, and great intention put behind them in Renaissance painting. So lapis lazuli, the ceiling of the Scrivenia Chapel, and lapis lazuli at different times was more valuable than gold as a commodity because of its the way it was loaded with religious and other value. So from a stone, the process of making lapis lazuli, there's other stuff online, but it's very involved in going through stages to draw out the pure pigment. So that's actually more involved than just grinding down the stone. There's actually removal of impurities to get to the lapis lazuli powder that I understand. But also similarly is azurite, which is in the copper family. There's some of the raw material that the QAGOMA team have made available for demonstration. Lazurite is a raw material, similarly made into a powder, and then with different binders, historically oil paint and these kind of things as binders to draw them into painting. That's where it becomes really fascinating in which binder for what material, which process of extrapolating the pigment for what material. Some materials don't like metals, so they have to be ceramic or stone or glass, these kind of ones. So that's another degree again, and there's wonderful learning that can be done there. But maybe that's in a different place to where we're interested today. But certainly some of the basic toolkit from that process from hundreds of years ago is the glass muller or muller, a glass plate, which for me is a leftover from one of my works. It is hardened, toughened glass. It could just be a louver. I also do use just a louver that I pulled out of nearby the studio, a glass louver. But for this purpose, toughened glass is the go. Glass on glass means that there won't be any transfer of a pigment to alter the colour of what you're looking to produce. The clear glass will only give a kind of luminosity, which was a deliberate process in other paint making. So from there, let's try some of, you can go out and purchase all sorts of palette knives which are beautiful. Teaspoons and spoons, dessert spoons are really actually more than adequate. So this is a bit of that surface oxidization from the steel plate. It could be taken off an old bomb of a car down the paddock, scraped it from underneath, anywhere, this kind of stuff. Old gutters particularly kind of flake up and go rusty like this. So a bit of that surface oxidization. Let's have a go at, typically you could use a art designated mortar and pestle. I've got a few of these that I have only for different purposes. Some are for purposes where I would deliberately put them into my body and they only ever have safe materials that way. Others I know that whatever I grind in there never goes near food or into my mouth. So an artwork designated mortar and pestle, or using the glass muller, we can pull that bulk material down to a finer powder, and with some time and with some, what I'd suggest probably is that each material and each situation is probably going to ask for a bit of your own experience and intuition and learning from that material. We can give formulas and give good ways to set about it, but each time you'll probably need to just work with that material to see what it wants to do on that particular day to get you the best result. So making that lovely fine powder, reducing that down to the finest powder possible, and I'll sort of shortcut it a little bit. So you'll find that rust oxidization comes down to a superfine powder really, really easily. It probably won't need to be strained, depending on what you want to do. I have little tea strainers, are a little coarse, but you can use Chuck's cloth as a really great strainer because it's got enough holes in there that it'll still let the superfine dust to pass, and then you can keep grinding. But you can find sieves around the house. You don't need to specifically go out and buy a strainer or a sieve. Chuck's cloth works really well for me. Let's say that that's been prepared to the way that I want it. If I transfer this out, and it's often such small batches that some good steady hands and no wind is really helpful. So then is some, different graded iron oxide there. My preference would be to get it more uniform. Here is some of the liquid gum arabic. Of course, water and ferrous metals will continue to shift the colour of it, which is, oils might be a different story. But knowing that from the outset, here's some gum arabic into the powder. And another brush. So very quickly we've ended up with a little bit grainy, but a good pigment which will still continue to transfer. So alongside the coffee, that's where it starts to settle down. So it'll probably go blacker actually, now we start to see that. Blacker areas as it oxidizes further. And as we shift and pull that out, it can be graded and brought down to a nice workable surface. So again, that is just simple rust. Obviously be aware of dust in all of these processes. Try to be considerate of the dust that you're kicking up. If you choose, I often choose for myself to wear a dust mask, a suitable dust mask. So that's the iron oxide. So that has achieved quite a workable paint. Often they're more of a glaze or a watercolor than like a film build paint like an acrylic. So thinking that from the outset, you're kind of more staining or putting the essence of the raw material into the paper. It would take a little bit of finessing to build that up because it is water soluble. So using probably really lovely soft like wash brushes, you could build that up to a solid block. I'd suggest that just slowly letting it dry completely in between and then quick runs over with a glaze, you'd be able to build that up. And really what it does end up doing is like a Japanese or a Chinese lacquer. For real, it gets beautiful lacquered finish as you build that up. But that requires a bit of finessing and a little bit of time and patience. All from rusted metal. Let's put that aside. So there's a little bit of kind of purpley red colours as that dries down, and I'll show again in a minute. Here's that red, what I believe is the inclusion from a red brick or a bit of a pebble. My glass plate has been used enough that it's got a bit of a keying surface on there. It's not completely smooth glass. So this is a slightly different process. I'd prefer to put some liquid gum arabic down first and grind this into that as a process. So using the found brick, grinding that back into the gum arabic is already producing quite a beautiful gingery coloured pigment. What happens if you've got a terracotta pot and that's been busted up and you use the chips of a terracotta pot? Yeah, I reckon there would be lots of different materials around the place that can be used. So straight up, that's created quite a vivid gingery coloured pigment. You can continue to grind that in to get a very strong one, but that looks good to me. And a brush, where'd it go? So I'll just pull a bit more of that iron oxide back out of the bristles for demonstration. But here is the straight up, what I say is a brick. Ends up being, fairly gingery red. And depending on the thickness of your solution of gum arabic, you can wash it right out like a real wash in watercolor, or you can, as I say, start to glaze it up and build it up. That's probably about 6 cents worth of material to get you on your way. Again, what happens if it is a terracotta pot? One of the students have a grandparent and they have a favourite terracotta pot. It breaks. The terracotta pot could be used to grind up and tell the story of that process, or to link back to a family story. So that's the way that I would consider the materials. Yeah, I'll leave that one there. So also showing and reminding that that because the gum arabic is water soluble, I deliberately leave leftovers on my glass palette because they can be picked up again at any point. So that's some of the dried material from another time, and quite readily it picks up again and goes as a transferable pigment. So then I've arrived at, when I wanted a specific process, purchasing artist materials, and as a pre-ground pigment, which is now readily available, really prominent. That's a very high saturated version of pre-ground artist dry pigment and gum arabic, and that's a super high density watercolor that I can reuse and reuse and reuse. So it might look crusty and dried out, but actually that's perfectly usable for quite some time. So the initial outlay there was really just for the dry pigment, and now I've got an ongoing supply of this high intensity red. And as another option during kind of lockdown times or around the classroom, there's also a source of pigment in pencils. And I have a theory, and let's try this out live, is that stripping back or even opening up the pencil, drawing out the pigment, grinding it up similarly, and applying it to the gum arabic, you can then end up with a similar kind of watercolor wash, I'd suggest. So, but for today, we'll just kind of grind a bit off. And this would be, of course, if there were damaged or busted up pencils, ones that are going to get thrown out, or old, sort of water soaked or whatever. So let's start there. There's a bit of pigment there. If I had that in a nice surface, I might grind that into a different way and then add the gum arabic. But let's just try this, for example, and see if it will begin to consolidate. So again, does someone inherit a pencil, or is there a pencil that's travelled in a backpack for for years and years, or there's a story of an Aboriginal elder who I read his story years ago, and he taught himself to read by using TAB bedding pencils. So TAB pencils also have another imbued history in that context. What is, if you have a crusty old pencil, what is its story that it can lend to the artwork? And there we have a usable transferable pigment. It's a bit thinner. What is it? It's it's a bit thinner and a bit lighter, but it'll probably dry down pretty vivid, I'll suggest. So that's pencils. And then in a really similar way, there's a bit of a stub of a dry pastel, not an oil pastel. I don't believe it's a Conte. I'm going to say it would be one of the old dusty dry pastels. And I reckon that's going to do a similar one. Or if there's any charcoal out of a fire, or little stubs of charcoal sticks, little leftover stubs that you can hardly pick up as well, they can be ground and even maybe set into little watercolor capsules. I've used in the past ice cube trays. I found that one a bit tricky to how to get them out, but if you have sweet chili sauce containers from takeaway, perfect. Leftover stubs from Contes or pencils or whatever, grind them up, set them in gum arabic. There's a ready supply of a watercolor or other pigment that you can use into the future. There's all sorts of options being outlaid around making pigment, but swinging back then to say Renaissance painting and how to look around the place for other sources of pigment. Lamp black in the bottle or tube historically has come from the inside of the glass kerosene lamp, or the lamp. So that is the black soot that has been captured and refined and processed to make lamp black, I understand. So then if that's one way it happens, where else does that process occur? I drove in from Western Queensland yesterday, and I'd been considering what is the dust that's on the vehicle. I did clean the windscreen, but on the windscreen wipers, what dust or pigment is sitting there waiting. Around tyres, around hubs. Obviously grease is not going to be compatible with water-soluble gum arabic, but if lamp black comes from the capturing of that soot, where else can you find free, readily available sources of small amounts of pigment? And I'd say, yeah, things like that. Certainly, I see them around a lot. Copper and galvanized pipes go blue and green, gorgeous blues and greens. The stability of those colors is in question for me, but as they oxidize, they chunk up and they give lumps of different kind of azure colored, because it really is copper, azurite sort of coloured pigment. There would be a bit of play involved in understanding the stability of that and how to work with that, but there's a free and natural source and around pipes and other things. So then, yeah, what's on the exterior of a car that's nice and safe? The dust on the tyres or the dust on the windscreen, particularly if you've taken a journey, and where has that dust come from? So then, perhaps there might not be so much time to get into making a composition, but I have a friend and a colleague who, during the QAGOMA's process out at the Carnarvons last year, she, Vicky Saunders actually made for me or gifted me a watercolour she made from the pigment there. So it had pigment and water and gum arabic made essentially to this kind of scenario, and then literally using the water of that location, a portrait was made, or a landscape, I call it a portrait of a place, a portrait of who the place is. A portrait was made of that location on a nice watercolour paper and gifted, and so for me I still have that as a memory of actually the place that was being depicted in the composition. So skillful, beautiful, skillful washy watercolour to create the landforms, but knowing actually its means of production imbues it with more care for me, or more interest for me as an artist, the way I tend to work, because it is rooted in all those different parts of the story. Yeah, and shifting from there, then what is the substrate you paint onto? So that was a watercolour postcard, and again, a postcard is typically talking about a place or a time that is not now or nearby. But what are the other materials that might be available? Things like paper bark does take pigment, but you tend to have to build that up on the surface of paper bark, I understand. If that's available, if it's readily on the ground, this kind of thing, without intervening in the life cycle of a tree or a series of trees, if that's readily available, that paper bark might be one. Other different barks, offcuts of timber, and cardboard is something actually I've got an interest in. QAGOMA, in one of the APTs, had a series of artworks that I believe came from the Pacific on cardboard boxes, and that's always stuck with me, that the leftover cardboard box had been used as the substrate. So what happens if gum arabic is built in, layered and layered and layered, and you create a good, nice, strong substrate from a cardboard banana box or similar? So again, there might be some of the artist's intent in the material that you're working onto, the substrate you're working onto, and perhaps we might leave it there. One last pointer is that as it might be evident by now, should you be needing to move on and not come back for a short period of time, that will dry out. The kind of gummy, sort of jelly set gum arabic, that'll dry out, and you can add water to that at a later state and use it. This one will go off, so make choices in the amount of gum arabic that you produce at the time that you want them, so that you don't have large amounts that are going to waste and sort of turning and becoming vinegar or cheesy, this kind of stuff. So I try to also be really considerate of the resources that I'm using.